Hello, good afternoon. Welcome back to our study of the book of James. I'm Michael Hite from the Bear Valley Bible Institute in Denver, Colorado, and we are studying the New Testament book of James. I am glad you're with us. I'm glad you're participating. I look forward to today's study. We've been doing this now for going on the end of 3 weeks now, and we're quickly approaching the end of our study. Looks like we may finish today. I'm not exactly sure. We'll see if we can get through it today. I know that you can probably hear my dog barking in the background, so apologize for that. But hopefully that'll stop soon, and we'll just keep on going. We have been studying the book of James now for a while, and we're in the beginning of chapter 5. So if you have your Bibles and be turning to James chapter 5, that's where we'll pick up our study. I did mention this as of the last class, that I would like to ask your prayers. We here in Denver are expecting a very large snowstorm. They're still predicting here in Metro Denver 2 to 4 feet of snow, which could break some records if we actually get that much snow. So pray that everybody stays safe and sound. We are a city that's prepared for snow, that's for sure. But when you start talking about those kinds of numbers, it's unusual for us. So we're all excited to see the snow start tonight and into tomorrow. But we're looking forward to it. But we also want everybody to stay safe, right? So as we look at James chapter 5, we're actually in the second of 2 illustrations that are on this idea that began at the beginning of chapter 4. Now, chapter 4 really connects to the end of chapter 3. And so the end of chapter 3, he was discussing this different wisdom, the wisdom that is from above, the wisdom that is different than this earthly and natural wisdom that is being used by these teachers in chapter 3 that drives them to bitter jealousy and selfish ambition. And he says the outcome of that is disorder and every evil practice, right? And then in chapter 3, verse 17, he contrasts that wisdom that is demonic in its origins, earthly in its origins, with the wisdom that comes down from above. And again, that connects us back to chapter 1, verse 17, that good and perfect gifts come down from above, coming down from the Father of lights. And so this wisdom is first pure, then peaceable. You remember that list. Then gentle and reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits. It's a good gift, right? It's not the result of the wisdom that's from above is not evil practice. It bears good fruit. And then he talked about that the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace, those that are seeking peace, not division. That contrast between the wisdom of the world that creates disorder, disunity, evil practice, and the wisdom that is from above that creates peace. It brings righteousness. It brings our justification. It brings about peace. And then as we got into chapter 4, he started this discussion of then what are the sources of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is it not your pleasures that wage war in your members, right? It's their worldliness that's driving the division. It's driving this conflict between brothers and sisters in Christ. And this idea that it's their worldliness that is causing these. You remember we're talking about 2 groups of people, the poor and the rich. And so that conflict is causing them to fight and quarrel. And James actually calls them adulteresses for wanting that relationship with the world. And he said the solution to that is to humble yourselves, right? God is opposed to the proud, verse 6, but gives grace to the humble. And he talks about how we humble ourselves, submitting to God, resisting the devil. He goes through a series of imperative commands there in chapter 4, verses 6 through 10. He then moves to this idea of judging our brother and lifting ourselves pridefully above our brothers and looking down on them and judging their actions, deciding whether what we think of them and being willing to say what we think about them. And he says, that's not right. There's only one lawgiver and judge, and you're not him. So don't look down on your brother. Get rid of that pride, right? Humble yourself again. And then he gives two examples of how this worldliness is driving us. The first is at the end of chapter 4 with verses 13 through 17, when he talks about these businessmen who are deciding to go to such and such a city and spend a year there and make a profit. And two aspects of that example that I think are pertinent to our discussion. One, they're not considering the Lord in their plans, right? James says they should be saying, if the Lord wills, we'll do this. Instead of what we want, we should be asking what the Lord wants. The other aspect of that we looked at is that idea of doing business may actually be that they intend to cheat people out of their pay in order to make a profit. And if that's the case, again, they're driven by their worldliness. They're driven by their pleasures, and that causes the problem. And then as we began chapter 5, he talks to the rich. Now, both of these illustrations come with the phrase at the beginning, come now. Notice the beginning of chapter 4, verse 13, come now, you who say, right? Talking about those businessmen. And then in chapter 5, he says, come now, you rich. And so he's talking to these rich people, and he says, come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you. We talked about this a little bit. What miseries is he talking about? I personally take the view that I think he's talking about Judgment Day. I know that's a future event, but their actions right now are bringing miseries upon them for Judgment Day. I certainly think that's the context of this passage. He's going to talk about in the last days, you have stored up your treasure at the end of verse 3. And ultimately, he's going to talk in chapter 5, verse 7, when he talks about to the brethren, be patient until the coming of the Lord. So there does seem to be this view toward the end times in chapter 5 that would indicate that. It's interesting that he uses kind of a present tense here, your miseries which are coming upon you. Again, I think that's the idea that our actions, our deeds are being watched by God now. They have future consequences. But he's observing us now, isn't he? He watches what we do. Not that he's watching in order to punish us with every move we make, but simply we're going to give an account for the deeds that we do in the flesh. He can also be alluding to the idea that what's happening with these rich is that they are their miseries which are coming upon them is this worldliness that is driving them to cheat their laborers out of their wages, is a mindset that should bring about their misery. If you remember, we connected this idea of weep and howl. That word weep is the same word that we saw back in chapter 4, 6 through 10, when he explained how to humble ourselves. And he said in verse 9, be miserable and mourn and weep, right, over your sinful condition. Well, these rich should be seeing what they're doing as that which separates them from God. They are not acting in a righteous way. They are acting in a very worldly way. They're committing adultery with the world, and that should cause them to weep and mourn, to howl over these miseries about their relationship with God. They're not doing that. And that's often the problem, isn't it? We enjoy our sinful situation so much that we don't consider God in that situation. But he says, your riches have rotted and your garments have become moth-eaten. We talked about this a little bit. The word here for riches can also be translated as treasures. And he says that your riches have rotted. Well, how do riches, treasures rot? We need to remember that in the first century context, wealth was not just money in the bank. It wasn't like we look at wealth today where we have bank accounts or retirement accounts that have lots of money in it, or stock portfolios and that kind of thing. In the first century, wealth was held with physical things quite often. You had storehouses full of grain. You remember the parable of the barns in Luke chapter 12. The man had these huge barns filled with his wealth. Well, that would be foodstuffs and garments and those kinds of things, not just necessarily coins and money, although that's part of it as well that he's going to get to in a second. And they've stored up so much wealth that it's actually rotting. And your garments have become moth-eaten. Again, expensive clothing was one of the ways they measured wealth in the first century. And they have so much of that that's going unused that it's actually rotting. The food is sitting there until it rots, and the garments are sitting there until the moths come in and eat them. Now, certainly we should be mindful of what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6, that idea of, don't lay up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, right? Where thieves break in and steal. We need to be focused on laying up for ourselves our treasures in heaven where moth and rust don't destroy. But these men are storing up for themselves treasures on earth, and they've got so much of it that it's rotting. Now, I want to stop here for just a second and talk about something that happened to me on one of my first mission trips to Africa. I went to Tanzania, and I was teaching a course there. We have a preaching school in Arusha, Tanzania. We've been doing that work for a long time now. And I was teaching the preaching students there, and we were talking about this verse, actually. And they didn't understand. They were asking about America. And I was trying to explain to them about our refrigerators. And for many of them, they don't have those. What happens is they actually go to the market, buy their food, they come home, they eat it, but they don't store up that stuff in their refrigerators. And I was recounting this idea that I have this box full of food that's just there whenever I want it. And some of them were astonished at that idea that we could just have access to that kind of thing whenever we want it. The other part of that was I was mindful of the fact that every so often my wife and I go to our refrigerator and we realize that some of the stuff that we've had in there has been in there so long that it's rotted, right? I mean, when was the last time you cleaned out your refrigerator and had to throw a bunch of food away because you had so much of it that you let it sit there until it rotted? Well, that's part of the issue, isn't it? Now, I don't think that's sinful. Don't get me wrong. If you had to throw away some food this week, I don't think that you committed this sin that James is talking about. That's not my point. But we are very wealthy compared to others in the world, aren't we? Where we have so much that sometimes we let it sit there until it just goes bad. And James's point is going to be, what did you do with that? Your garments have become moth-eaten. That wealth should have been put to work, right? That wealth should have helped others. It should have benefited others. Your treasure has rotted. All of that food could have gone to feed the poor. It could have gone to feed the laborers that worked in their fields. But instead, they're just piling it up more and more and more. Now, one of the other things that I was mindful of on my trip to Africa on that was we had just moved some stuff into a storage unit here in the States. We had some extra stuff and we didn't have enough room in our house and basement. And so we had to rent out a storage place to store some stuff. It's a big business in the United States these days, is we not only have so much that it won't fit in our houses, but many of us rent storage units to put our stuff in the storage units. And again, I think we've got to ask ourselves, could that stuff be sold and put to better use than just storing it? Think of the money that we spend to store things when maybe we could convert that back into money and we could use it to feed the poor. We could use it to visit the widows and orphans in their distress. You remember he said that back in chapter 1, verse 27, that idea of that's pure and undefiled religion is to help those that need the help, that brother or sister without the food and in need of clothing in chapter 2. Could we be using some of our wealth more effectively? Do we really need so much that we store it up until it rots? The reality is that we do that a lot. And maybe if we were more mindful of the needs of others, not just ourselves, if our thinking became more about projecting out toward others and what their needs are rather than just satisfying our own needs, maybe we could do more with what the Lord has blessed us with. And that's exactly what James is getting at to these rich people, is they have so much that they're allowing to just go to waste, that is going to be a witness against them. Notice what he says in verse 3. Your gold and silver have rusted, or corroded is more a proper word here, and the corrosion will be a witness against you and will consume your flesh like fire. You know, I often think of piles of gold coins. You think of some movies where there's this big pirate treasure. You think of the Hobbit movies where the dragon has this whole castle filled with gold, just piles of gold and silver. But it's sitting there so long that it's covered in corrosion. It's covered in dust and dirt because it's hasn't been used for anything. It's just been stored up so that you can look at it and say, hey, look at how much I have. But you're not doing anything with it, right? And so its use is what James is really talking about. The fact that we have so much that goes unused. They had so much that was going unused. He says the rust will be a witness, will testify against you. Well, when? In the judgment day, when the Lord asks us to give an account for what we've done in the flesh, right? When we give an account for our deeds, is the Lord going to ask us what we did with the things that he blessed us with? I think he's going to, isn't he? I mean, that's what this whole section really alludes to, is this idea that there's going to be a time when the gold and silver, the corruption, the corrosion that is on our money from not putting it to use is going to testify against us. You know, I need to say that I have run across this with churches sometimes, and I'm not calling any individual congregation out. We all have our own needs, and the shepherds of that congregation need to make decisions for that congregation. It's not my job to do that, but talking to men who don't want to touch the money that's in the bank, right? We've got all this money stored up, but we need it just in case of an emergency. And I remember one time talking about a mission effort and trying to get a congregation to get involved in supporting a mission effort. And their answer was, well, we've got all this money, but we really can't spend it because what would happen, for example, if there was a tornado and it blew the roof off of our building? What would we do? We need that money. And I was like, well, don't you have insurance on the building? Well, of course we have insurance on the building. We're not irresponsible. The building is insured. And it was like, well, wouldn't the insurance cover the roof on the building? Well, it would, but you never know what. And we kind of set that money aside and we think, man, I just need to hold on to that, right? That's my security blanket. We start to put our trust in having that money in the bank instead of using that money and actually allowing God to bless us by using that money, right? If we use the money for his will he get us more money? At some level, I think he will. It's interesting when we look at the end of the Old Testament, and I realize that in the book of Malachi, the context there is a little bit different. He's talking about tithing in an Old Testament context. But one of the problems that they have is that they are not giving what they should be giving. They've been cheating the Lord out of his tithes. And I get that we don't tithe like the Old Testament today. That's not my point. But notice in Malachi chapter 3, verse 8, he says, will a man rob God? Yet you are robbing me, but you say, how have we robbed you? And he says, in tithings and offerings, you are cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, the whole nation of you. But notice verse 10, but bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, so that there may be food in my house, and test me now in this, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you a blessing until it overflows. Isn't that the idea? That if we trust God enough to give and use the things that he's given us, won't he bless us? He will, won't he? I mean, if we don't have to worry about how big our bank accounts are in order to store that up. Now, I'm not saying we should be irresponsible, and I'm not saying that everyone should go empty out your bank accounts. There is some need to have some money set aside for emergencies. I think 2020 taught us that things change, right? We have unemployment. A pandemic has caused a lot of people to be out of work, and there certainly have been issues that needed to be dealt with. But when we trust in that money just to hold on to it just in case, to the excess and to the exclusion of doing the Lord's work, I think we're going to give an account for it. You know, there in one commentary, I read this quote, and I think it fits very well. It says, "There is an awful warning in this for the church today. So many in the churches in our day have been blessed with much of this world's goods. What's being done with it? We cannot give a token to the Lord or even a liberal share and feel that the rest is ours to live upon in luxury and ease. We must give an account to God for all of it." And he cites Luke 16, verses 9 through 12. There are many things that a Christian may use his money for: his family, for his own needs, and helping others, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28, for the payment of taxes and good deeds, Romans chapter 13, Titus chapter 3. One need not give all he has to the Lord, but this should not lead us to think that we're not responsible for it all. We are stewards of all of it. And will the rust of our unused blessings eat at our flesh like fire on that day as well? This is a serious question for members of prosperous congregations. I think there's something to be said there when we ask ourselves if the rust and corrosion on the money in this first century is going to be a witness against them. Do we think that the rust and corrosion on our goods are not going to be a witness against us if we abuse that power and won't consume our flesh like fire? Now, he uses this phrase, "will consume your flesh like fire," like chains that have been around you for so long that the rust is literally eating into the flesh. That burning of the acid, of the rust coming in contact with your flesh will consume your flesh like fire. It will actually eat away at your body. And he says that it is in these last days that you have stored up your treasure. It's in these last days of your life. Now, again, what does he mean here by the last days? Typically, sometimes it's talking about this last dispensation before the Lord returns. I think that's certainly the possibility. But it's in these last days of your life that you are storing up for yourself. You're showing what you're pursuing. Do you remember back in chapter 1, the rich man is going to die in the midst of his pursuits. He's going to pass away chasing after something. In his last days, what is he chasing after? Well, the same thing can be said here. In these last days, you have stored up your treasures, but again, you're storing up for yourself treasures on earth, not treasures in heaven. Matthew 6:19 should ring in our heads over and over again, that where is our treasure really being stored up? What are we storing up for ourselves? Are we storing up wrath? Are we storing up goods that are going to give a witness against us? Or are we using what the Lord has given us, knowing that he will bless us on into eternity if we use the things that he's provided the way that we should? And so he gets to the heart of the problem of the rich here in verse 4. He says, behold, that idea of see with your eyes, see, behold, the pay of the laborers who mowed your fields, and which has been withheld by you, cries out against you. And the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. He starts to say, look at how you got your money. Now, the first part is what you're doing with your money, right? If you're just storing it up, you're going to give an account for what you're doing with the blessings of your riches, your treasures that God has given you. That's one thing that you're going to give an account for. But now he turns to not only what you're doing with it, but how did you get it to begin with? Is it important how we earn our money? I think it is. Can we be involved in sinful behaviors in order to earn our money? I don't think so. We're going to give an account for that, right? We're going to give an account for those sinful behaviors that we've encouraged others with through our money, through our business, whatever the case may be. And notice these rich are getting richer from the pay of the workers who mowed their fields. Basically, again, when we understand how the first century worked, these laborers would come to a rich landowner and would agree to work in the fields for the day. And at the end of the day, they'd be given their pay. They would then take that pay into the marketplace and spend it, buy whatever food and proteins they could to feed their family, go home, fix that food, eat that food. Guess what? The next day, it would start all over again. It's what in a more modern context we call living hand to mouth, right? The money goes into your hand, it goes to buy food, the food goes into your mouth, you go back and earn money that's put in your hand, which you go buy food to put in your mouth. You live hand to mouth. Well, that certainly describes the first century with the rich and the poor. And these poor laborers are going to the fields. They're making a commitment to the landowners to do the work, to bring in the harvest. And so they work in the fields all day. And at the end of the day, they go to collect their wages. And the rich landowner says, nope, not going to pay you. And that causes these laborers to cry out. Notice he says, the pay of the laborers who mowed your fields, which has been withheld by you, cries out against you. The actual money itself cries out to God about how these wealthy people got their money. It's not just the corrosion. Notice what he's doing. He's personifying this wealth. He says first that the corrosion on the gold and silver will witness, will testify, speak as if it will, against you. And here he says the pay itself that you've held back from these workers, the pay cries out against you. It doesn't even matter if the laborers cry out themselves. The actual money itself is a testimony before God, and it cries out against you. It's testifying as to how you got your money. And we've got to be careful how we earn our money, don't we? And he says, and the outcry of those who did the harvesting. So you've got the outcry of the pay. The money itself cries out. You've got the laborers who are crying out to God because they're being mistreated. They're being abused. They're being cheated out of their rightful pay. And that's causing great problems in their life. We're going to get to that in just a second. But the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. Now, notice that translation very carefully. It's not the Lord of the Sabbath, like the first day of the week. Or the seventh day of the week. It is the Lord of Sabaoth. It's translated in, and you might have a footnote that is the Lord of hosts. This is actually the military name for God in the Old Testament. It's often translated in the Old Testament as the Lord Almighty or the Lord of hosts. And that Lord Almighty and Lord of hosts is the military concept of the God of heaven. He is the Lord of the hosts, the angelic armies that he can call into his service to do his bidding. The power of this word and this description of God is what James is leveraging to this Jewish mindset, right? These Christians are Jews that have converted to Christianity. And so he brings that Lord Almighty, Lord of hosts idea to them and reminds them that the Lord is a powerful, mighty God who commands the armies of the angels, and the angelic hosts are at his command. And what you are doing has reached his ears. And there's a recompense to that, isn't there? There's the idea that God can seek his vengeance on you and has the power to do that through being the Lord of the Sabaoth. the Lord of Sabaoth, and the idea that he can command his armies against you. You remember, God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Well, part of the opposition that the Lord can bring is that military concept of God, that military concept of the Lord Almighty. And so he says, you have lived luxuriously on the earth. Then notice, their life here is luxurious. He says, you have lived luxuriously on the earth. He's talking about this word luxuriously is a word that means a life of self-indulgence, a life of carousing and revelry. That's this idea. Basically, it's just been one big party for you. You're living it up. You're living the high life, as some used to say in television advertising back in the day in our culture. But it's this idea of living this life of self-indulgence. Everything that you do is about yourself, and it's caused you to live in great luxury. But notice, you've lived in great luxury where? On the earth. And that period of time will end, won't it? Our life here on earth will come to an end. And when it does, we're going to give an account. Are we mindful of that? That's really drives us back to the whole problem that started in chapter 4, right? When we're committing adultery with the world, when we're participating in this worldliness to the point where we're rejecting our relationship with God, we choose the friendship with the world, we have forgotten that this world is going to pass away, that we're going to die, that at some point this luxurious life on the earth is going to end, and then we're going to give an account to the lawgiver and judge. And what about our eternity? Have we considered our eternity now? Or are we just considering our flesh now? Are we just considering what feels good and the things that we want to chase after now? It's very short-sighted. And so he says, you have lived this luxurious life on the earth and led a life of wanton pleasure. This word for wanton pleasure, again, is another word that describes this idea of indulging oneself beyond the bounds of propriety. It's a word that means extravagance and waste. They've just thrown it away on themselves. They just spend it on themselves. The only place that else that this word is used is it's used of the widow in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 6, who lives in pleasure. And the text there says, and thus she is dead while she lives, right? She's just living this life of pleasure, but that causes her spiritual death, doesn't it? Those miseries are coming upon her now. She's going to give an account for it in the judgment. But the same thing is true for these rich, is these miseries are coming upon them now, but they're storing them up for a day of judgment. And so he says, you have lived a life of wanton pleasure. You have fattened your hearts for a day of slaughter. Now, again, I think he has in mind the end of time, the day when God is going to come and seek his vengeance and pay us for our deeds that are done in the flesh. But there's another possibility here, and that is that they have fattened themselves up for a day of literal slaughter. Not too far down the road from this, if our date is right, that we're late 40s AD, there's going to be an event that's going to occur in 70 AD where the Romans are going to come destroy the Jewish system and literally wipe it out. They're going to siege Jerusalem. And Josephus talks about this siege in which literally hundreds of thousands of people die and tens of thousands are taken captive by the Romans. And it's awful what happens to Jerusalem. Well, who did the Romans go after when they took over the city? They went after the wealthy. They went after where all the money was and where all the foodstuffs were stored and all of that kind of stuff. It may be that James is talking about that physical slaughter that is going to come in 70 AD. I think he's more mindful of the end of time when they're going to give an account to God and they're going to be slaughtered. Now, I know that this is a serious section of text, and I don't mean to downplay it a little bit, but I used to love the Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny cartoons. And there's one in particular with Daffy Duck that I remember, and it centered around Thanksgiving. And Daffy is on a farm and he befriends a turkey, and it's a couple of months before Thanksgiving. And Daffy realizes that this turkey is slated for Thanksgiving dinner, right? And he tells him, I know how you can get out of this. You need to go on an exercise plan. You need to not eat all this food that the farmer's wife and the farmer are feeding you to fatten you up. You need to reject that food, go on a diet. And he has the turkey running around the farmyard. And the whole time Daffy's eating all of the food, right? And the last scene of this cartoon, the farmer comes out, it's Thanksgiving Day, and he goes to the pen to get the turkey, and he lifts the turkey up, and the turkey is nothing but elbows and eyeballs, right? There's no fat on the turkey at all. And he's like, Ma, we can't eat this turkey for Thanksgiving. There's no meat on the bones. And he turns and the camera pans and shows Daffy Duck. And Daffy has eaten all that food all that time. And he is now this giant fat duck. And the farmer says, well, I guess it's duck for Thanksgiving this year. And the cartoon ends. Well, what was Daffy's problem? He was mindful of what could happen to him at the end, right? The same thing is true of these rich people in James chapter 5. And I'm afraid the same thing can be true for us as well. We warn people about worldliness while we ourselves participate in it. And we are fattening ourselves up for a day of slaughter. There's going to come a time when God is going to ask us to give an account for the money that he provided to us, the treasures that he gave us. What did you do with it? Did you help the widows and orphans? Did you help take care of that brother and sister that were in need of food and daily food and clothing? Did you use what I gave you to help them? Or did you just store it up to the point where it rotted away and wasn't used for any good thing other than to satisfy your own ego and your own pride and your own arrogance? Remember, God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. There's going to be no grace for us if that depicts us. If we simply are about feeding our flesh, living this life of luxury on the earth, and we really don't care about anyone else. We don't care that others are struggling. You remember in the first century, the depiction of the church in the first century is actually, to us in a modern context, maybe even a little shocking. But in Acts chapter 2, they were doing all kinds of things to help one another. After Peter preached the sermon, they were, chapter 2, verse 42, they were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and the breaking of bread. And they kept feeling a sense of awe, verse 43 of Acts chapter 2. And many wonders and signs were taking place through the apostles. And all of those who believed were together and had all things in common. And they began selling their property and their possessions and were sharing them with all as anyone might have need. Have you ever thought about that? I mean, they recognized in a first century context that there were people that needed, again, we have the rich and poor, those that were rich that owned land. What did they do? They actually sold it. You have a number of accounts there in Acts chapter 2 of people who actually went and sold their property and brought the proceeds and gave it to the apostles to be distributed to the members that needed it the most. Is there something that we could do with some of the stuff that we have stored up rather than just let it sit there until it rots? You know, that treadmill that we hang our clothing on rather than use for exercise, that, you know, we had good intentions. We were going to get out there and get in shape. And we bought this nice treadmill, and now it's in the back corner of the garage and we hang our winter coats on them. Could we sell that and give the money to the poor? I think we could. Could we go through the stuff that's just sitting around that we're not using anymore and donate it to someone that could actually use it? I think we could if we thought about it that way. But instead, we just let it pile up to the point where it eventually just decays to the point where it's not good for anybody or anything except for maybe hanging some winter coats on. And then what? Are we fattening our hearts for a day of slaughter as well? in the way we look at the people around us? Do we look at the things the Lord has given us as a way to help others, or do we see it just as a blessing to us individually? Now, again, I'm not suggesting that we need to all sell everything that we have and give it all away. That's not the point. But are there people that are still in need? And are we trying to help those that are in need? That's what he said pure and undefiled religion was back in chapter 1, verse 27, to visit the widows and orphans in their distress, to find out who needs what and try to be involved in helping them get it. Maybe some of what they need is just sitting in our garage. Maybe some of what we need is sitting in our bank accounts. You know, a number of years ago, we had a missionary, one of the graduates of our preaching school preaches in Arizona. He's actually part of the Navajo reservation down there. And he came to school, and he has been preaching all over north New Mexico and Arizona, pretty rugged terrain. And he was coming up. He spoke at Bear Valley one time and was kind of sharing his adventures doing mission work on the Navajo reservation down there. And while he was driving to Denver, his truck broke down, just broke down. It was always breaking down because he was actually preaching at congregations that were 50 to 80 miles apart. And the roads between those congregations were dirt, rocky roads in the New Mexican desert. And so it was really hard on his vehicle. And while he was driving to Denver, his truck broke down, and they managed to get some baling wire and duct tape and limped on into Denver. But he said, you know, if someone knows where I can go to get my truck looked at so that I can get it fixed so that I can get back to work. At the end of that congregational meeting, a brother in Christ walked up to him and handed him the keys to his pickup truck. I mean, just literally said, you need this more than I do because you're doing the Lord's work with it. And I'll tell you what, you give me your truck, I'll give you mine. I'll worry about getting your old truck fixed so that I can use it. You take mine and you go do what you need to do for the Lord. Now, I'll tell you, it wasn't a fair swap. But the Christian brother didn't care about what was a fair swap. It wasn't about a profit. It wasn't about what's in it for me. It was simply a moment of selfless giving. Brothers and sisters, we need more of that. We need us to stop holding on to those things that are ours, that help us live our lives, sometimes in luxury, sometimes in wanton pleasure, when there are others that need the help. Now, I know, and don't get me wrong, I'm sure there are a lot of you out there that are very generous to the church and to others. And if you are, you do well. That's great. But I also know that there's more to be done in this world, and there's more we can do. And there are some that don't give the way they should, some that aren't as generous with their money. And the warning of James chapter 5 is that the rust and the corrosion and the moths are going to give a testimony against you if you're not careful. And so we need to see our wealth the right way. We need to see what we can do with it. We also need to understand how we get it is important, and what we participate in to make our living and to fill our bank accounts. We're going to give an account for that as well. And so he says, you have fattened your hearts for a day of slaughter. You have condemned and put to death the righteous man, and he does not resist you. Now, verse 6 is a powerful verse. And I've read commentaries that suggest what they're talking about is Jesus here, that Jesus is the righteous man that they put to death. I don't think this has anything to do with Jesus at all, I'll tell you. First of all, he's not been talking about it in that context. He's been talking about the laborers who have gone unpaid. They're the righteous men in this scenario, aren't they? How are the laborers righteous? Well, they committed to do a day's labor for a day's wage. They said, if we work in your fields, you'll pay us, right? And so they did the work. They brought in the harvest. They kept their end of the deal. The wealthy landowners didn't keep their part of their deal. They're the unrighteous in this scenario. But the righteous men are the laborers who've been cheated out of their wages. They've done the work they said they would do, and yet they've not been paid. And since they've not been paid, guess what they can't do? They can't go into the market and buy their food. They can't go home and feed their families. And literally, I believe verse 6 is talking about literally your actions, you rich, have condemned and put to death the righteous man. They're dying of starvation because of your greed. They're dying of starvation because of your selfishness. They're dying of starvation because you want to store up all this food in your storerooms to the point where it rots away and becomes useless when it could have been used to feed all the people. You could have fed all the workers that worked in your fields. But instead, you chose to use it to fatten up your heart, right? It's about how you think. You fattened your heart for a day of slaughter, and the righteous man is being put to death, and he does not resist you. Well, what does it mean that he doesn't resist? Why don't these, poor workers storm the castle and take what belongs to them? Well, because then they wouldn't be righteous, would they? I mean, they can't just go storm. I always think of Beauty and the Beast, right? When they go to storm the castle, and you've got this long line of people with the pitchforks and the torches, and we're going to go storm the castle. We're going to go get what belongs to us. We're going to go show this rich man what for. And if they do that, they're not going to be righteous anymore, are they? The righteous have no means of resisting the rich. The rich are the ones that personally drag them into court. Do you remember that back in chapter 2? This discussion about showing partiality, one of the arguments James made was it doesn't make sense to butter up these rich guys. They're the ones that drag you into court. Well, why? Because they can pay for the courts. They have the money to pay the fees to take the poor people to court who owe them money. But the poor people don't have any way to use the court system to go after the wealthy. They don't have any money. They don't have any way to resist. All the poor person can do, all the laborer can do, is keep his side of the bargain, do the work in the hopes that the rich will pay him. And if they don't, then ultimately that rich person may be signing his death warrant. He may be signing that deed that puts that worker and his family to death, literally. You remember back in chapter 4 when he was talking about the pleasures, he said, you lust and do not have, so you commit murder. Chapter 4, verse 2. Well, I think this is what James is referring to. The murder that's occurring here is the murder of the righteous laborers who have worked in the fields and yet don't get paid for it. And as a result, they're put to death, literally dying of starvation. I think that's the context of this passage. And so the actions of these rich don't consider God or eternity. The actions of the businessman in chapter 4, verses 13 to 17, don't consider God and eternity. They all are focused on their own pleasures. They're all focused on their pride and arrogance, that adultery that they're committing with the world. And that's why God says he is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. These men need to humble themselves before the Lord. Let the Lord lead them. What do they both lack? They lack wisdom. We've talked about this idea of wisdom throughout the book of James. Wisdom is the ability to see earthly situations the way God sees them and to act accordingly. Well, the businessmen don't see the next year the way God sees it. They think they're in charge of the year and they can do anything they want with it. These rich don't have the wisdom to see their earthly situation the way God did. If they did, they'd be using the money God's blessed them with rather than allowing it to testify against them in judgment, wouldn't it? And so they lack wisdom. And we so often can lack wisdom when the world creeps into our lives. When the world takes over our hearts, when the world invades our thinking, when we become stained by the world, chapter 1, verse 27, then we lack wisdom, don't we? We stop seeing things the way God sees them, and we start seeing things the way the world sees them. And in that danger, we can be fattening up our hearts for a day of slaughter. We can be chasing the wrong things. We can be pursuing the wrong things. And when we die, we're going to give an account for that. And we can also recognize that our actions affect others, don't they? In this case, you have righteous men who are dying because of the selfish actions of the wealthy. And so we got to ask ourselves a question. Is he talking about Christians here in chapter 5? Now, some will argue that the section from chapter 5, verses 1 through 6 is not talking about Christians. You'll notice he doesn't call them brethren. And here in verse 7, he says, therefore be patient, brethren. And some people will say, see, he wasn't talking about Christians in chapter 5, 1 through 6. And now he's returning to a conversation to Christians in verse 7. I certainly think that's possible, but the context of this letter has been an admonition to Christians, warning them against the world stains that can invade their hearts and invade their thinking, right? Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this, to keep yourself unstained by the world. Chapter 1, verse 27. And so is it possible that these wealthy are Christians who are supposed to be in a relationship with God, but they're committing adultery with the world? They're chasing their pleasures instead? I certainly think that's very, very possible. I don't think there's a reason to just take this out of the Christian context and say these wealthy people are those that don't have a relationship with Christ. And when we do that, the only reason I'm talking about this is sometimes we do that and we talk about them, right? Those people who are worldly outside of the church. Well, when we use terms like that and we talk about them, the problem is their hearts. The problem is the way they think. Well, that may be true, but could it be us as well? I mean, is it possible that these kinds of sins occur within Christian people? Certainly. As a matter of fact, the sin of partiality in chapter 2 was being committed in the worship assembly. They should have known better, shouldn't they? They should know to see all men as created equal, all of men made in the image of God. They should be loving their neighbor as themselves, all of those things that chapter 2 talked about, and yet they weren't. They were seeing it through very worldly eyes. They were seeing it through this world-stained lack of wisdom. And so I think it's very possible that chapter 5, verses 1 through 6 is not just talking about those that are outside of a Christian relationship with God, but those that are in a Christian relationship with God, but they are adulteresses. They're committing adultery with the world. Chapter 4 talks about that idea, chapter 4, verse 4. And so don't just project this on people who aren't Christians. This message is as poignant to Christians as it is to non-Christians, right? And so, but there is a noticeable shift in verse 7 that we do need to deal with. He says, therefore, be patient, brethren. He's talking to brethren. Now, I think he is no longer talking to the rich. Now, who's he talking to? Well, he ended the context in chapter 5, 1 through 6 by talking about this righteous man, right? He said, you, rich, have condemned and put the righteous man, the workers, to death, and he does not resist you. Therefore, be patient, brethren. I think he's talking now to those righteous men who are brethren, those Christians who are doing the right thing. They've been working in the fields. They aren't getting paid. And now he's going to admonish them to be patient. Well, why would he need to do that? Because there's certainly a significant temptation for them to start to think in a worldly way and think, I'm going to go to that castle and I'm going to get what's coming to me from this rich guy one way or the other. Well, if they do that, they're not going to be righteous anymore. And so notice what he says. Therefore, because of everything he said about the wealthy in 1 through 6, therefore be patient, long suffering, brethren. That idea of patience is a word that means to be long suffering. It's a word that comes up throughout Scripture. that reminds us that life isn't always easy as a Christian, that people have worldly mindsets, and sometimes they're going to commit evil against us. And what's our job? To be patient, right? You remember in chapter 1 when he talked about trials, what do we need in trials? We build endurance, right? Well, patience and endurance go hand in hand. They're two different words, but it is this idea of being long-suffering. Know that the long game is important. Eternity is more important than what happens right now. Now, what I'm about to teach is particularly challenging. I think it really strikes at the heart of where our thinking is. And that is, notice he says, be patient, long-suffering, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. What's he telling these laborers? The Lord is going to take care of these wealthy people, is he not? You remember the verse 4? The pay which has been withheld by you cries out against you, and the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. God has heard. God is going to take care of it. You need to be patient for the coming of the Lord. And if you remain righteous, even if you're one of those righteous that is put to death by the actions of these wealthy people, if you remain righteous, is the Lord going to work that out? He is, isn't he? He's going to take care of you. He's going to give you praise and glory and honor. Remember, chapter 1, verse 12, blessed is the man who perseveres, who endures under trial, for once he has been approved, passed the test of faith, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. He's reminding them of that promise once again here in chapter 5, that they need to remain patient, long-suffering, wait on the Lord. Let the Lord take care of the rich person. That's not your job. So often we want to be the instruments that seek the revenge of the Lord. But that's the Lord's business, isn't it? Let the Lord take care of those things. We need to do what's right. We need to do what God wants us to do. Act the way God would have us act. Doesn't mean that there's not righteous indignation over the mistreatment, but we can't take things into our own hands, can we? We can't violate the law in order to bring about some righteousness that is against the law. We've got to recognize that we need to be patient. And there's times when doing the right thing is going to bring suffering into our lives. It just is. It's not always going to work out well on the earth. You remember that contrast? The rich have lived their life on the earth in luxury, but what's going to happen to them afterwards? Well, when we look at the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, Lazarus was in the gutter one minute and he's in Abraham's bosom the next. And the wealthy man's living it up in his luxurious life, his life of wanton pleasure. And the next he finds him scorching and dying of thirst and longing for just a drop of water to satiate his tongue. You see, we've got to have that long-term view of life, that long-term view that takes us beyond the physical. James has been talking from the beginning of the book that we need to see the spiritual, not just the physical, right? We need to have the wisdom to see earthly situations the way God would see them and act accordingly. Well, what does God want for the righteous in this situation when they're being cheated out of their wages? He says, be long-suffering. Wait for the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it until the early and the late rains. This whole section is about patience. Do you notice that? Look at how many times that word patient appears in this context. Verse 7, therefore be patient, brethren. Verse 7, being patient about it until the early and late rains. Verse 8, you too be patient, strengthen your hearts. Verse 10, as an example, brethren, of suffering and patience. He's going to talk about the prophets of old and how they're an example of patience. This whole section is about being long-suffering. He's left the admonition to the rich. Now he's talking to the people that are impacted by the actions of the rich. And what does he tell them? Be long-suffering. Wait on the Lord. Let the Lord do what the Lord's going to do. Let the Lord reign and rule. Don't take things into your own hands. Be patient, just like a farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil. Now, notice a farmer doesn't go out and put seed in the ground and come back the next day with his bushels ready to harvest the grain, does he? No, it takes time. There's a process going on, isn't there? The soil is that plant is gonna grow, and eventually it'll give a crop. But it takes the early and late rains. It's not something that happens overnight. Well, the reality is the Lord's gonna come in his own time, isn't he? But we need to wait on the Lord. We need to be looking to that moment where we have our hope fixed completely on that return. That's what Peter's going to say in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 13 through 15, the idea of fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought at the revelation of Jesus Christ. We need to be mindful of the Lord's second coming, and that needs to influence our behavior now, doesn't it? It's some future event, but it has ramifications for us now in how we behave. And he's telling them that they have to be willing to wait. The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it, long-suffering, until it gets the early and late rains. You too be patient. Strengthen your hearts. Now notice the contrast between the rich and the righteous here. The rich have fattened their hearts for a day of slaughter. They're thinking, and remember in scripture, the heart isn't just the muscle that pumps blood in our chest. It's that center of how we think. And he tells the rich, you have fattened your hearts for a day of slaughter. Your worldliness is setting you up for a judgment day that's going to be horrible. And what does he tell the righteous? He tells them to strengthen their hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. Now, did James just lie to these first century brethren? He said to them, strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. Well, if our date is right, this was written in the late 40s AD. That's almost, not quite, about 20 years or so. That's 25 years or so, 2,000 years ago. Lord still hasn't come. Was the coming of the Lord near? Well, it depends on what you think about when you think about the coming of the Lord. And sometimes we only think about that day sometime in the future where Jesus is going to appear and the clouds are going to be rolled back as a scroll, and we see him coming in the clouds and every knee will bow. Judgment Day, right? And I would argue that the illusion is waiting for that coming of the Lord, that judgment day. But when does that come for us? It comes at the end of our life, does it not? When we understand the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, and I don't actually think it's a parable, I think it's an account. But when we look at that account of the rich man and Lazarus, what's the teaching? That there's a gulf spanned, and once you die, there's no way to cross back over that gulf, right? When you die, your future, your eternity is fixed. You no longer have an opportunity to change what you did on this earth. And if we're right in the context here, and I believe we are, that chapter 5, verse 6 is talking about righteous men that are being put to death by these wealthy, what's he saying? The coming of the Lord is near. It's as near as the end of your life, which for those that are being starved out by the rich, maybe sooner than you think. If their families are starving to death, if they're literally being murdered by the wealthy because of this cheating them out of their wages, then the coming of the Lord is indeed near, is it not? And I would argue that the coming of the Lord is near for all of us. It's as near as the day of our death. That's when the Lord comes for us. That's when we stand in judgment. Now, I get that there is going to be a judgment day, but time doesn't work the same way outside of this earthly realm. And when we die, our eternity is fixed. The coming of the Lord is near, and we can't change our behavior. We can't change the deeds that we did in the flesh. We have to learn to wait on the Lord, but we have to trust that the coming of the Lord is near. Notice what he says. The coming of the Lord is near. So that should allow us, that should give us the strength to endure, shouldn't it? Through these trials and difficulties, knowing that it's not going to take very long. Again, I've read this passage a couple of times. If you flip over to 1 Peter, I think Peter echoes exactly what James has been talking about in chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, when he says, in this you greatly rejoice, talking about our salvation, that inheritance. He says, in this you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been distressed by various trials. It's just going to be a little while. Life is just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Isn't that what he said back in chapter 4, verse 14? Our life is short. The coming of the Lord is near. Do you have the wisdom to recognize that the coming of the Lord is near? And what you do now impacts what happens when the Lord comes. He's going to talk about them complaining against one another. Look, verse 9. So do not complain, brethren, against one another, so that you yourselves may not be judged. There's our point, isn't it? There's a judgment coming. You need to be careful about what you're doing now, because you're going to be judged. And he says the judge is standing right at the door. He's watching what we do. The coming of the Lord is near, and he's watching. You remember the pay has reached the ears. The cry of the pay has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. He hears what's going on. He's not just asleep. You know, some people, I think, their image of God is that God is just sleeping, waiting for judgment day, and he's not paying any attention to what's going on down here. Well, the reality is he's very involved in what's going on down here. He's very aware of what's going on down here. He hears the prayers of the righteous. He hears the outcry of these laborers. He hears the witness and testimony of the wealth that's gone unused, and the wealth that's been created through the victimization of the laborers. He's heard all of that, and he's going to ultimately take care of it. He's going to resolve those issues in the end. The question is, do we have the wisdom to recognize that he is standing right at the door and his return is near for us? Now, again, I would argue that it's nearer for some of us than others. I just had a birthday this year that was kind of a big number for me. I've become more and more aware as I get older in my life of how much nearer the coming of the Lord is in my life, as opposed to someone who's in their teens or 20s who thinks they're going to live the next 100 years or 200 years. It seems like sometimes when we're young, we're not even thinking about the end of our lives. But when we're not thinking about the end of our lives, sometimes we can be surprised, right? The Lord comes like a thief in the night. We weren't expecting him. And the reality is that can be the case for us. Our behavior needs to be dictated by the wisdom to understand that the coming of the Lord is near and that he is standing right at the door. He's watching what's going on. And so we need to be long-suffering. We need to be patient. Don't take things into your own hands. Don't go get even with that wealthy guy that's putting your family to death. You need to wait on the Lord. Now, can you imagine how hard that would be? Can you imagine if your family is dying, how hard it would be not to go seek vengeance on that wealthy man and steal what belongs to you and maybe even murder him in order to get some of that wealth back? But if you do, the judge is standing right at the door. Aren't you going to give an account for that to the Lord? And I don't think that, well, I was just getting what belongs to me is going to work, is it? It doesn't work that way. We need to remain righteous. We need to do the right things even when it's hard, even when it brings suffering into our life. That's the whole letter of 1 Peter. Be willing to suffer the way Christ did. Christ was mistreated, but he becomes our example in suffering. If we flip again over to 1 Peter for just a second, I want you to notice this example that Jesus left for us when we're suffering. As hard as it may be, in chapter 2, verse 21, starting in verse 21 of 1 Peter, He says, for you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his footsteps. Christ set the example for how we should behave while suffering, okay? And he says, 1, he committed no sin. So you can't sin and use suffering as, but Lord, we were suffering. My children were starving to death. I had no choice. No, you do have a choice. You can do the right thing. You can wait on the Lord and let the Lord take care of it. Or you can become unrighteous and give an account for your action. He committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. What else might the laborers do? The laborers might start making a deal with the bosses and saying, yeah, I'll work in your fields if you pay me. But then they go find a shade tree to sit under and say, well, I don't think he's going to pay me anyway, so I'll sit here. If he does pay me, it's just what he owes me from before anyway. And they may slack off. They may lie in order to try to create a deal that gets them some revenge or gets even. Have you ever noticed how we never get even? We're always trying to get a little bit more. But anyway, no deceit was found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. They spoke evil of him, but he refused to speak evil of them. And while suffering, he uttered no threats. These righteous men shouldn't be threatening the rich with physical issues and harm. But what did he do? He kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. See, that was the example that Jesus gave of how to suffer. Entrust yourself to the one who judges righteously. He's going to take care of it in the end. We need to let God be God, don't we? We need to allow God to do what God's going to do. And so I skipped over it a little bit, but notice the beginning of verse 9. Don't complain, brethren, against one another. Well, why would they be complaining against one another? Because things are rough. You got a whole group of people who aren't being paid. They're potentially being put to death by the actions of these wealthy guys. And if you start to complain against one another and start to backbite and sow the seeds of discontent, what might happen? You can find yourself in a situation where you cause the uprising that you shouldn't cause, right? You can cause other Christians to lose hope. You can cause other Christians to stop waiting on the Lord and stop being long-suffering. We need to recognize that when times are hard, what we need is encouragement from one another. We need to lift each other up, not just have a pity party together. The word here for complain means to sigh or to groan. Have you ever noticed how when you get in the room with someone who's complaining and sighing and groaning about how hard things are and what's going on with all the COVID stuff and how it just brings you down. I mean, you just kind of get in this funk, don't you? I get it. Yeah, things are horrible. And the positive, the hope goes out of the room, doesn't it? Well, the same thing is true for these first century Christians who are dealing with significant suffering in the face of doing what's right before God. It's bringing about their suffering. And he says, don't turn against one another in those times. Don't sigh and complain against one another. Don't have a pity party together so that you yourselves may not be judged. Now, I think that's one aspect of it, but notice the phrase against one another. Don't sigh and moan against one another. What happens when they have no way to resist the wealthy landowners? They really don't have any way righteously to get even with the wealthy. So what might they start doing? They might turn and start fighting amongst themselves. You ever see that happen? How things turn inward and we start to deal with each other more than we deal with the real problem on the outside. Instead of lifting each other up, we need to encourage one another, remind each other that the Lord is coming, that the Lord is near, that he'll take care of it and he'll take care of us. We need to be a sense of edification and building up, not a source of tearing down. And so often we can find ourselves on the other side of that, can't we? We can find ourselves on the side of this that says we're in the tearing down business. We're constantly complaining. We're constantly backbiting. We're constantly the downer in the group instead of reminding each other that the Lord has got this. The Lord has heard us and the Lord will take care of it. Doesn't Scripture teach us that? Didn't the Lord hear them while they were in Egypt? Didn't the Lord hear them through all of their struggles through the Old Testament? Didn't the Lord hear them and respond? The problem was how they responded to the Lord, not the Lord not responding to them. Even after 400 years of silence, the Lord comes back brings Jesus, the Messiah, into the world to solve the problem, doesn't he? So this idea of don't complain against one another, brethren. Are you a source of positivity and encouragement, or are you the source for someone's depression and problems? You know, there's an old saying, and I think some of you have probably heard it before, but some people brighten a room when they enter it. Some people brighten a room when they leave it, right? When people see you coming, does their countenance fall because they know all they're going to hear is the complaining, that everything's bad and nothing's good? And they become this depressing, downer discussion every time. We need to be those that demonstrate hope. We need to be those that demonstrate faith. Do we not? We need to lift each other up. Why? Because we recognize that the judge is standing right at the door. He's watching our behavior as well. He's watching how we act, not just the wealthy. The wealthy are going to get theirs. The Lord of Sabaoth has heard the cries of the money and the cries of the laborers, and the Lord is going to give judgment to them. But he's also going to give judgment to us based on how we act and what we do. And so he says, do we recognize that the judge is standing right at the door? And he gives us an example, and he uses the prophets of old. He says, as an example, brethren, of suffering, real physical suffering. That's what this word is. In the original language, this word means physical suffering. It's sustained affliction. He's going to come back to that word in just a minute. That's why it's so important now to understand. He's talking about physical suffering and patience. Well, these righteous men are dealing with physical suffering. They're being starved out, and they need patience. They need to have this endurance. And so he says, as an example of physical suffering and patience, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. We count those blessed who endured. There's our word, isn't it? From chapter 1. What do we need to get through trials? Endurance. We build endurance. We build that long-suffering attitude, right? And so he talked about the need for endurance in trials in chapter 1, and he's talking about the need for endurance in trials and suffering in chapter 5. We call those bookends. This whole book is bookended around that idea that we need to learn to endure, be patient in trials, knowing that the testing of our faith produces endurance, chapter 1, and knowing at the end that the coming of the Lord is near, and he's going to take care of us in the end, that he's going to make everything okay in the end. Now, not necessarily in this lifetime, but certainly on into eternity. When we think about Lazarus and the rich man, Lazarus dies in the gutter. Did the Lord work it out for Lazarus? Well, it depends on how you see it. If you're just thinking about from a worldly standpoint, you would have to say, no, he died poor in the gutter with the dogs licking his sores. But if you have wisdom to see this earthly life the way God sees it, then you would have to say that, yes, the Lord worked it out for Lazarus because Lazarus ends up in Abraham's bosom. God took care of Lazarus. Did he not? Not necessarily here and now, but on into eternity. We have to recognize that need to say that it's about our eternal existence that becomes more important. And so he says, as an example of suffering and patience, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Now, when we think of the Old Testament prophets, we think those were godly men. The Lord was with all of them, right? You think about all men like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel in the lion's den. And we think about how blessed they were that God was with them. But have you ever looked at their life on the earth? It was terrible. It was filled with abuse from those that rejected God. It was filled with suffering. It was filled at times with isolation and real physical distress and suffering from their own people. You think about Paul. We lift up the Apostle Paul and think of how great he was and how the Lord was with him. But when you look at his life, he describes in his letters all of the beatings that he took, the stonings, the shipwrecks. Did it go easy for Paul? No. But the Old Testament prophets, I find it interesting that in Acts chapter 7, you have Stephen giving a witness to the Jews that are persecuting him. And at one point, Acts chapter 6. And at one point he says, which one of the prophets did your fathers not persecute and kill? Which ones had it easy? The reality is none of them. And I'm sorry, it is chapter 7. I'm trying to talk and flip my pages at the same time. It's Acts chapter 7, verse 52. Which one of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? They killed those who had previously announced the coming of the righteous one, whose betrayers and murderers you have now become. As a matter of fact, in Mark chapter 12, Jesus teaches a parable against the religious leaders, the Jews. And in Mark 12, he talks about these servants of the landowner. The landowner in that parable is God. And notice what he says. The harvest time came and he sent a slave. God sent a slave. And in this parable, God is the landowner and the slaves are the prophets of the Old Testament. And he sent a slave to the vine growers in order to receive some of the produce of the vineyard from the vine growers. And they took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. What did God do? He sent them another slave and they wounded him in the head and treated him shamefully. And he sent another, and that one they killed, and so on with many others, beating some and killing others. That's the description of the Old Testament prophets. And yet we consider those blessed who endured, don't we? We look at their lives and say how blessed they were that God spoke through them, how blessed they were that God was with them. But their lives weren't easy. They were examples to us of long suffering, weren't they? Of real physical suffering and endurance and patience, knowing that God would take care of it in the end, that God would resolve the issues ultimately for them. And the same thing is true for us. We need to have the same view that they had. We count those God approved blessed who endured back then. Those prophets endured. You have heard of the endurance of Job, haven't you? That's the example that James is going to give here in verse 11. You have heard of the endurance of Job, how he lost everything, right? If we go back to Job, he loses his family, he loses his cattle, he loses his wealth, he loses his health. And yet he endured. He remained faithful. And what happens at the end of the book of Job? He gets it all back, right? No, he gets it back and some. He gets back more than he lost, doesn't he? And so James says, you have heard of the endurance of Job and have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings, that the Lord is full of compassion and is merciful. You know the outcome for those that have been long suffering. You know the outcome for the prophets. You know the outcome for Job. So they become examples of suffering and patience to us today, don't they? Can we apply the wisdom that we learned from those lessons in our Old Testaments of those great men of God who stood for what God wanted them to stand for, who remained righteous, even in the face of evil, even in the face of abuse, even in the face of persecution, remaining righteous? And ultimately, does God not take care of them? He does, doesn't he? Just like he did with Job. Job, even in a physical way. But ultimately, do we recognize that the coming of the Lord is near? And can we wait for that? Can we wait on the coming of the Lord, knowing that his coming is near, knowing that the judge is standing right at the door watching our actions? He's going to judge the unrighteous, but he's also going to judge us. And I think the point that James is making here at the end of the letter is that we must remain righteous, even in the face of great suffering and evil that's being perpetrated on us by others. We do the right thing, and God will take care of us. Now, God's going to take care of those that are committing that evil. Don't fool yourself. They're going to be slaughtered. That's what he said. They fattened up their hearts for a day of slaughter. You can look at letters like 2 Peter that talks about the assurance that God has always punished evil. You can look at letters like Jude that echo what Peter said in his second letter, that remind us of the assurance that God has always and will always punish evil. But if we do what's right, even in the face of that evil, then God will take care of us. You've seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings, and that he is compassionate and full of mercy, right? He can give us what we can't give ourselves. We can't necessarily get restitution for the evil that others are doing to us. These workers, they can't resist. They don't have any means to get even with these wealthy landowners without becoming unrighteous. Let the Lord do that. The Lord will give you mercy. The Lord will show you compassion. He will also judge the actions of the evil. Be patient, waiting on the Lord. Well, we've got a few minutes left, but this is going to be a good place for us to stop. Starting in verse 13, we have a challenging section. We don't have much left. And I'll be honest with you, on Monday when we come back, I don't know that we'll take the full 90 minutes. Now, I say that, but I also know me, and it may be another 90-minute class, but it might be a little bit shorter than 90 minutes. But we'll come back Monday and we'll finish up this great book of James, and we'll conclude. But notice what James has been doing throughout the book. Have a spiritual mind. The spiritual is more important than the physical, right? Over and over again. Do you have wisdom? Can you see your earthly situation the way God sees it and function accordingly? Or have you been stained by the world, sucked into the worldliness and that pleasures and passions of that luxurious life? And that's what you're chasing. And if that's the case, you need to turn from that. You need to turn to the Lord, because he's watching what we do. We're going to give an account for what we do with the treasures that he's given us. We're going to give an account for how we earn them. We're also going to give an account for what we do while we're suffering. And we can trust that the coming of the Lord is near. It's not going to be very long. Even if we have to suffer the rest of our lives, it's just a vapor that appears for a little while. And then an eternity of calm and peace and rest, right? Well done, my good and faithful servant. Enter into my rest. That's what we want, isn't it? That's what we're hopeful for. That's what we set our sights on. That's what controls our behavior on this earth. Well, I hope you'll join us Monday as we finish up this book of James. The previous audios, if you've just joined us, the video and audio of this is on the Digital Bible Study Facebook group page. You can go back a few weeks and catch up on the rest of the book. As I mentioned, we'll come back Monday at 12 o'clock Mountain Time, 12 to 1:30 Mountain Time, 2 o'clock to 3:30 Eastern Time, and we'll finish up our wonderful study. Again, I hope that you're finding this a blessing. I hope it's challenging your thinking. I hope it's causing us to really ask ourselves, where is our wisdom? Is our wisdom rooted in worldliness, or is our wisdom really rooted in an understanding of God's will in our life? That's what we need to be focused on, and that's what Scripture helps us to see. And so until Monday, I pray the Lord will bless you. Again, keep us in your prayers this weekend. By the time I talk to you Monday, we may have 4 feet of snow here, but I trust that we'll be safe and warm, and the Lord will watch over us. I pray that he'll watch over you too until we get together the next time. Thanks for coming. May the Lord bless you.